Hello and welcome to another episode of Judge of Character. As always, I'm your host, Steve. Now, I know I said I'd wait a little later on to talk about this character, but I just couldn't help myself. Tonight we're going to talk about the boss from the Metal Gear franchise. Well, sure, you know who Solid Snake and Big Boss are, but God forbid you try to learn anything about anyone else from the series. The boss is another character in the Metal Gear franchise, one of many. However, since her debut in Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, the boss has proven to be one of the most important characters in the series, if not the most important. In fact, why stop there? I would actually argue that the boss is in fact the best character out of the entire franchise. But why? We'll learn more about that tonight, but before we do, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the franchise itself. In my back-to-back episodes about both Solid Snake and Big Boss, I briefly went on about the series itself, about how it more or less created the stealth game genre. It really is one of my favorite video game franchises, right up there with Tekken or Resident Evil. The story itself spans over 50 years of an alternate history, and it's chock full of memorable characters, which is an achievement in and of itself, since most secondary or tertiary characters usually have little to no definition to them in order to keep the focus on the main characters. While the story can be heavily convoluted at times, it's still a highly enjoyable franchise. But if the series is so full of great and wonderful characters, what makes the boss better than Big Boss or Solid Snake? This is gonna sound really bad, but, well, she's a woman. Now, that's not meant to be sexist, but the boss's gender is a major factor. Sadly, sexism in video games is still a major problem. Don't believe me? Just ask Anita Sarkeesian. The boss's gender is important because she's not portrayed like a lot of other well-known female video game characters. She's not overly sexualized, she's not some idealized form of beauty, and above all else, she's entirely capable of holding her own. Hell, the boss is easily one of the strongest female characters I've ever seen, which leads to the first point in her favor. She's a badass. I already covered some of the major points of what makes her so freaking awesome in the episode I did of Big Boss. If you watched that one, then you already know what I'm talking about. If you didn't, then here's a quick reminder. She created the Special Forces, so the Navy SEALs, Delta Force, all those guys, they kinda owe her. She invented CQC, Close Quarters Combat.
I want to do that.
She gave birth on the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. And she was the first person in space. Ever!
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Granted, that's only applicable to the universe in-game, but the point still stands. But there's more to this character than her just being a badass. I like to talk about the personality of every character, mainly because it's an important factor in any character. Without a good personality of some kind, we're not likely to forge that ever-important connection that's necessary. But in the case of the boss, it's much more complex, largely due to the nature of the very story itself. Because of her actions throughout the game, we don't get a really clear view of her personality until the very end. Naturally, this leads to the next major factor, her complexity as a character. You see, the best characters are often the ones that are a little bit more complex. Characters that require effort on the part of the audience in order to understand them often leave a much greater impact on the audience. Since we have to invest more time in them, we tend to get more attached to them. And the boss is one of the best examples, especially in gaming. When we first meet the boss, it's under the assumption that she's a member of the support team for Naked Snake, the main protagonist of Metal Gear Solid 3. She's treated as a good guy. Girl. But then she suddenly turns traitor, defecting to the Soviets and beating her former student to a pulp. At that point, she shifts from being merely a supporting character to the main baddie. Or did she? It should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Here there be spoilers. If you've not yet played any of the games and you want to experience the story for yourself, then stop the video right now and go out and play them. Alright? The video will be waiting for you when you get back. And besides, it's a great experience. Anyway, for the rest of you, let's continue. Long story short, it turns out that the boss's defection was a ruse, part of a mission of her own to retrieve something called the Philosopher's Legacy, essentially $100 billion, for the US. But things didn't go according to plan. Instead of simply playing at defecting for a short time and then coming back with the money, the boss was forced to play the long game and had to sacrifice herself and her legacy as a soldier and as a patriot in order to keep America from getting blamed for attacking the USSR. This included her being assassinated by her former student, Naked Snake, who would later become Big Boss. The boss would end up going down in the history books as a despicable traitor and a war criminal, also America wouldn't look bad on the global stage. I know, I said long story short, but believe me folks, that's the shortest I could get it. In any case, this is a great example of a well-rounded character. Despite how she's presented in the story, we know that there's more depth to the boss, and we're shown that depth and that complexity as the story plays out, especially considering all the things that she has to go through. The next element to the boss is one I mentioned earlier. She's a female character, which in video games often comes with a healthy amount of negativity as far as portrayal is concerned. But what makes the boss a great character in this regard is how she defies the standard female video game stereotypes and becomes what I feel is an ideal female character. She's strong, not just physically, but mentally as well, going hand to hand with the guys and usually beating them, in addition to coming up with and executing her own strategies. With one exception towards the end, she's not overly sexual. In fact, what few sexual elements there are to the character are greatly overshadowed by everything else about her. Most people who play the game pretty much don't even think about her sexually like they would certain other characters. And those who do fantasize about the boss, well... No, you know what? Fuck it, I'm not going to tell you. If you really want to know exactly what I'm talking about, go Google Rule 34 The Boss. But perhaps the biggest aspect of the character that makes her memorable is the impact she had on the franchise as a whole. Metal Gear Solid 3 is the first game in the series, chronologically speaking, taking place before the very first Metal Gear. With the introduction of the character comes a radical shift in how all of the games that came before it were perceived. Big Boss's villainy in the first two Metal Gears now comes with a better understanding of his motivations. Your understanding of the Patriots in Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4 becomes clear when you realize that they were in fact based on the boss's idea of a unified world. Basically, the boss's actions and beliefs in the third game cast an immense shadow over the rest of the games, both past and future. She was responsible for Big Boss, who was responsible for Solid Snake. Her ideals were the basis of the Patriots, which corrupted her vision to their own ends. Her impact on the series is one that is felt far and wide throughout the entire franchise, like a massive earthquake that can be felt worldwide. And that is what makes her a more important character than either Solid Snake or Big Boss. She essentially started everything. And now for the negative part. Unfortunately, despite how she's obviously one of the better female characters there are out there, the boss doesn't get anywhere near the level of recognition she deserves. Outside of the franchise, the boss simply isn't as established as, say, Lara Croft or Samus Aran, which is a shame because she's just as fantastic as either one of them, or any other female gaming character out there. This really needs to be changed. Honestly, even if you've never played any other Metal Gear game, I'd recommend playing at least Metal Gear Solid 3, just to really experience how awesome this character really is. And while I know Kojima isn't listening, if Konami made a Metal Gear game where we played as the boss, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. So, how to sum this up? When you get right down to it, the boss really is the most important character in the franchise, more than Solid Snake or Big Boss. The effect she has on the rest of the franchise is too big to ignore, and while the events of Metal Gear Solid 3 aren't always mentioned in later games, they still created a domino effect. Many of the plot elements and character developments in later games can be traced back to the third game and to the boss herself, either directly or indirectly. This is easily her most defining moment as a character, and what makes her so memorable. Overall, though, it's a combination of her role in the story, her actions, and how she's done within the narrative that ultimately creates this fantastic character. So, in the end, this is one of those characters who, while she may not be as memorable outside of the franchise that she calls home, she still deserves just as much respect and attention as any other memorable character out there. Hell, maybe even more. I mean, come on, she's got a well-defined personality and motivation, she's got a great story, and she kicks lots of ass? I'm sold. If only there was a way to spread the word about her. I got it! I'm your host Steve, reminding all of you to stay in character. If you don't mind, I've got some converting to do. Good afternoon, sir. Have you heard the good news about the boss? This is going to be a lot harder than I thought. Oh well, onward!
Pardon me, sir. Have you heard the good news about the boss?